Chicago will always hold a very special place in my heart in terms of the Run Around America and subsequent histories. We didn't stop in 1994 with the Rainbow Roll for the end of AIDS. Me and 5 other inline skaters rollerbladed the rainbow flag from San Francisco to New York, and Chicago was one of our stops at that time. It was actually the inspiration. I got the inspiration for that from a Chicago native, Anthony Rapp from Rent. If you recall, saw Rent, you know about Anthony. And we were talking about trying to do what we could do about fundraising for AIDS, and we were to meet in the lobby of the Paramount Hotel, and he met me with these rollerblades over his shoulder, and I said, "Well, you're a rollerblader." Yeah, well, during the discussion, suddenly I couldn't run anymore, but this light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, oh, we could rollerblade. Of course, when I was running around America, road surface did not play such an important role. But it's everything when you're rollerblading. New Mexico's roads are made of a combination of concrete and lava. And it's like, so it's not great. But then we were back here just last year, as a matter of fact, for the International Rainbow Memorial Run. The event since the Rainbow Run for the End of AIDS in 1990 and the Rainbow Roll for the End of AIDS in 94, it has evolved into what's called the International Rainbow Memorial Run. And it is for AIDS and breast cancer awareness, and it's still to bring the rainbow flag as our symbolic torch from San Francisco, the Athens of the Gay Games, to the host city of the Games. And we go to the past host cities and do small memorial runs, not ultramarathons, and quilt ceremonies. And we were here last summer, and Karen was there. We unfolded the quilt, and Proud to Run was part of the International Rainbow Memorial Run at that time, and I'm so thrilled that it was also a walk. And so the Federation co-president and myself walked the distance. I ran my last race in Cologne last year, and I came in dead last, and I knew this was definitely my last event. So I just want to say, thank you very much for being here this evening and supporting Gerber Hart Library and Archives. I am so grateful to Karen for deciding to celebrate Area's 25th anniversary along with Gerber Hart's 30th anniversary. 2011, as Karen mentioned, marks a number of significant anniversaries or milestones for both Area and for the AIDS crisis. In addition to the first official case of AIDS being diagnosed 30 years ago, and my beginning my Run Around America 25 years ago, this past March, on December 1st, Area will present its 20th gathering and candlelight march in observance of World AIDS Day. It's also, it'll be, the Red Ribbon will be 20 years old. And of course, we've just learned that this is a great year for the Deppies. Congratulations again on your 50th wedding anniversary. It's amazing. And congratulations to Andrew as well. I sometimes feel like my Run Around America was one of the best kept secrets of public events. I often, over the years, and when these milestones appear and I scan these timelines of the history of AIDS, I search in vain for the run to be recalled. So I hope you can understand why I appreciate so much this opportunity for it being acknowledged, and I'm very hopeful that this will be kind of like the jump start to move some of the other initiatives forward. The story of the run is yet to be told in either any form, book, film, or any form at all. So I'm very happy to recall some of those moments with you tonight. One of the reasons I'm so committed to the archival effort of preserving a record of not only Area's accomplishments and the struggle against AIDS and the struggle for LGBT rights is because I believe it is vitally important to the health and well-being of our community, especially our youth. We've seen the the marginalization of, we've seen the success that some other marginalized minorities are having in their efforts to get their accomplishments recognized and preserved for future generations. And I feel that this is what we're called to do, and why your being here tonight is so important. And this sense of lack of self-esteem or whatever, I think it comes from the lack of visibility and appreciation of our history. Reading about the group of parents who are suing the school board in their community in Minnesota for their neutrality stance on homosexuality, which, as they claim, has resulted in 8 teenage suicides just in that community alone. It's reminded me of why this is so important. And I found it not surprising that this was in the very district that is headed up by Michelle Bachmann and her husband, and this whole Pray the Gay Away movement, which we know is, and all of her comments with regard to that. For all of the process for which the LGBT community can rightfully lay claim in the more than 42 years since the Stonewall Uprising, we are still facing great obstacles fueled by fear and ignorance and intolerance. Not only must we continue to remain vigilant and be willing to stand up and tell the truth about our lives, about our community, we must preserve the legacy of our pioneers. Our contributions have always been so easily dismissed and forgotten. I've often wondered how the world's perceptions and long-held beliefs about sexual minorities might be altered if, like George Bailey in A Wonderful Life, our contributions to the culture of our race might be removed. How would those who deride and demonize us, or who taunt and torment us, or even tie us to a fence and leave us to die like those boys did to poor Matthew Shepard on that frigid Wyoming night 11 years ago this month, how would they feel if there would be no great warriors like Achilles, Alexander, Hadrian, Lawrence of Arabia, Mountbatten, Napoleon, Sitting Bull? Or what if there had never been Abraham Lincoln? Or such icons of movie star masculinity as Rudolph Valentino, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Marlon Brando, James Dean, Rock Hudson, or the actor who created Gandalf and Magneto, Ian McKellen? And what about that, master of horror, Clive Barker? And I'm sure that, those thugs who beat Matthew Shepard till he was unconscious and left him to freeze to death, do we think they might miss such rock stars as Elvis Presley or Green Day's Billy Joe Armstrong or Judas Priest's Rob Halford? And of course, without Robert Baden-Powell, there'd be no Boy Scouts. And before I start listing all of the gorgeous female movie stars, after whom I'm sure those two certainly lusted, but who would also be missing, I'm going to accept that you've got my point. There are so many issues and causes with which our community is challenged and in need of support. I'm pretty certain no one in attendance here is in need of convincing why it is so important to support institutions like Gerber Hart. Unfortunately, pressing issues such as the AIDS crisis has, demanded and captured our attention and our donations because of their immediate needs. But the archival effort deserves our focus, our commitment, our resources, especially because of the legacies that have been lost and are in jeopardy of being forever lost by that generation that was swept away by the first wave of AIDS. The exhibit that Will Brandt curated for Gerber Hart during Gay Games 7 here in Chicago, with memorabilia and the memorial quilts from the past International Rainbow Memorial runs, was truly one of the best, if not the very best, archival exhibit we've ever had at a Gay Games. And it is my will and my desire that we do something to at least match it in games to come. The run is not just about my story. It encapsulates so many people's stories. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those people. And I want to share an introduction to a book that you'll come to know more about in something that's going to be coming from Gerber Hart later, I believe. And that when Karen first approached me about this project, I said, oh, it's got to be this, it's got to be this. There's a book called The Color of Light. It's a Hazelden book, and it's called Daily Meditations for All of Us Living with AIDS, written by a great man by the name of Perry Tilleros, who himself was claimed by AIDS but left us a great legacy. And in that introduction, he says, there is an old native North American Indian tradition called Heyoka. The Heyokas, or sacred clowns, were people within the tribe who did things differently. They challenged people's thinking. They shook them up. Their function was to keep their people from getting stuck in rigid ways of thinking and living. They are also known as contraries because they lived backwards. They walked backwards, danced backwards. Everything they did was contrary to the norm. By their living, they symbolized the shadow of the great creator God, reminding people of their spiritual center. For gay people, the role of Heyoka is especially important. Not only are Heyokas often gay, the role of contrary is a sacred symbol of the role we play among society as a whole. From the beginning, there has been a Heyoka response to AIDS. When the normal response was to react with fear and panic, there were people dancing backward, responding with love and confidence. When every day the world began repeating a death mantra, our sacred clowns danced the dance of life. They talked about living with AIDS, surviving, healing, recovering. When the normal reaction to a diagnosis was isolation, our Heyokas dragged us into a community. When the world wanted us to be victims, they drew circles of light around themselves and stood in their power. Whenever it got dark, they turned toward the light. Whenever people said there is no hope, they said there is always hope. Whenever people said this isn't about us, they stood up and said this is about you. This is about us all. Our planet is sick. Earth has acquired an immune dysfunction. We are all living with AIDS. The American Run for the End of AIDS was my Heyoka response. And I promised Karen I'm going to talk a little bit about how it was done and the logistics and all. I have to admit, in doing this work the last several weeks and, finding these talismans and these photographs, I kept encountering these emotional minefields. And that's because this is also the beginning of what I've come to refer to as my season of tears. This is also the 20th anniversary of the worst year of fatalities for me personally in the AIDS crisis. In 1991, I lost 42 people in 1 year alone. And in the fall was devastating. I lost Alan Sobek, my former life partner, on September 16th, 1 week ahead of his birthday on September 23rd. 2 weeks later, I lost Bill Concoy, who was the director of the run, and 8 weeks later, my mother. I count her amongst the AIDS casualties. Although she'd lost many people who were quite dear to her to AIDS, losing Al and Bill was more than she could bear, especially because I'm sure she felt there was no one left to lose who would break her heart more than myself. Al and Bill are already part of the quilt, really. After we attended the planning conference in Washington for the 1992 quilt display, only a few days after Bill's death, during the conference, I had an epiphany. Karen knows I'm very good on epiphanies. It was an epiphany that gave birth to the run. But I had another one in which I realized that the black section at the top of our first Rainbow Run for the End of AIDS 12 by 12 quilt section, it had been reserved. We'd often, Mom and I had often talked about putting pins there from the run or something to along that effect. But I realized it had been reserved all along. I have to explain that this black monolith at the top had been made because I'd actually seen this quilt in a dream and seen had the logo of the Rainbow Run for the End of AIDS, and then a rainbow flag with the words "We Remember," and then a panel, and the first one was in honor of Tom Waddell and Keith Haring, and then the bottom half would be signature squares for California and Oregon and Washington and British Columbia, the 4 sections I was going to be running through with the flag. And suddenly I realized it had been reserved all along for Al and Bill. And so we drove back to Lockport, back at the back to the Niagara Frontier, and that was actually the last thing that she and I did together, was putting their names to that quilt. Little did I know I was going to lose her, within a matter of weeks. I'm running out of time, and all these people I want to talk about. Peg Gray. Let me talk about Peg Gray. Peg Gray was part of Chicago's front-runner, front-walker escort, that ran the final 17 miles into Chicago on the American Run for the End of AIDS. Those 17 miles were among some of the most grueling of the entire 9,000. It was a blisteringly hot day of 97 degrees with 100% humidity. We were dying along this very lakeshore that day, but I remember that Peg finished all 17 of those miles to the totem pole, where my beloved Bill was having a fit because we'd lost all the media that had showed up to cover the run. And I always was explaining to Karen and Pam that whenever we had an escort, I always keyed off the slowest runner, not the fastest, and so we missed them by an hour. Also, it was very important. Alan Sobek was a very much important part of the run because he was a stage manager with the La Cage aux Folles National Company, and he created our first benefit for the run when he was in Toronto, and then they did another one the first week of the run in Philadelphia, and the last one was when the run actually made it to Chicago, and they did this show called Carry On here, and it was a benefit for area and the Howard Brown Clinic. That was also the end of our first chunk. That was our first hiatus. We took a week off, and Mom and I drove back in her Buick. By the way, I guess I failed to mention that our pace car was Mom's Buick Regal, and she was the only road crew member to go the entire distance around America with me. And anyway, we drove back to New York where all the fundraising was taking place on the streets of Manhattan, and we needed to raise visibility for the run. Anyway, Peg, I was also very honored to serve on the Federation of Gay Games with Peg, for which she was the first female co-president. She was quite a diplomat and an advocate for many causes and a dreamer as well, among many other things, and I know she will be long remembered in this community. I need to talk about Mel. I know you wanted me to talk about the logistics, but I think I'm going to have to forgo those. Another time, when we get the book or the movie done, you'll find out about the logistics. Mel Sharon, I wear him on my jacket. He was my mentor. He was known as the godfather of disco. He owned West End Records. His former partner was the owner of Paradise Garage in New York. And he was part of that first original group of gay men that formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And I originally met Mel when I came to photograph his paintings, and he kind of mentored me into the whole dance scene as a lifestyle. And I remember him asking me one time, "Do you enjoy being part of the gay community?" I said, "Sure I do." He said, "Well, you're not really part of the community. What are you giving back to the community? You know, until you give something back, you're not really part of the community." And I had never even marched in a pride march until I marched with Mel and Ignacio Zuazo and Paul Poppin and the people from GMHC in 1983. And so Mel mentored me. I don't think he ever dreamt that what those seeds of mentorship would give rise to. I mean, during the 20 months it took me to run around America, I lost 25 friends to AIDS. I lost that many again and more every year after that, leading up with those worst deaths in 91. But even in 91, even though that was 42 friends the next year, I lost 37 in 92. The end of, the number of deaths due to AIDS started to diminish after 1995 with the advent of protease inhibitors, but there has never been a year since the beginning of the AIDS crisis that I have not lost loved ones to AIDS. At the end of 2007, after him being negative for 25 years, I lost Mel. As Shakespeare says, I have lost a brace of kinsmen. The AIDS crisis is the Holocaust of our era. Whether or not acknowledged as such, we are still in the midst of this Holocaust that has already claimed millions of lives around the world and with no end in sight. We need an AIDS Shoah project, and not just for remembrance, but for awareness and prevention before countless more lives are lost. Gosh, Gert, I'm gonna have to wait for you another time. Tom Waddell, I gotta talk about Tom Waddell. This jacket is probably the most precious thing I possess. It is his uniform jacket from when he was an Olympic decathlete in the 1968 Olympic Games. God, I gotta get to the chase. I met Tom, I gotta get this really quick. I met Tom in 1985 when I was organizing the run and training to get ready to do the run. In the summer of 1985, I just purchased a Greyhound bus pass that enabled me to get on and off and stop in places around the country where I network with people and organizations to gain their endorsement and their support. It was for this purpose that I first met Tom in July of that year at his clinic in San Francisco General Hospital. Tom invited me to his home on Albion Street for a kickoff party for Gay Games 2, the day before I was to run the San Francisco Marathon. Located in the Mission District, Tom's house was a unique combination of dwellings with a large enclosed garden. The main building had once been a German meeting hall, but the stage still remained, providing a perfect setting for meetings, parties, and other functions associated with the burgeoning Gay Games movement. Affectionately referred to as the compound, I thought I had stumbled upon Armistead Maupassant's Barbary Lane from his Tales of the City when I first went there for that Gay Games 2 party. Little did I realize that many of the people I met that day would play important parts in my life as friends, colleagues, and fellow directors of the Federation of Gay Games. My most vivid memory, however, is of Tom conversing and laughing while holding his young daughter Jessica in his arms. The late afternoon sun highlighting her golden hair. The sense of excitement, camaraderie, and dedication to the Gay Games was quite palpable, and I came away with the feeling that this was far more than a unified community. It was a family. I returned to the compound a little more than a year later in August of 1986. On the final weekend of Gay Games 2, I had already been running for 5 months by that time, having left New York on March 1st, heading north through New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and as far north as a satellite run to Montreal. Finally, after running west through New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, we reached Billings, Montana by the week of Gay Games 2. My mother, who was the only road crew member, as I told you, to go the entire distance, she and I flew to San Francisco for the final days of the games. The two women, who were also part of our road crew that first summer, took the bus because one of them, Tara Keener, was afraid to fly. Behind the wheel of our motorhome, however, she was one fearless lesbian. I couldn't escape the feeling of deja vu as I once again approached 141 Albion Street on another Saturday afternoon the day before I was to run a marathon. Only this time there was nobody there but Tom and myself. This was a moment I'd envisioned for many months and many miles. And although we embraced each other warmly, something was wrong. As we sat together on the deck overlooking the garden, I wanted to ask him 100 questions about how the week of the second gay games had gone, but I could tell he had something quite serious on his mind, and then he told me he had AIDS. I didn't want to believe it. This wasn't the way this moment was supposed to be. Now, 12 years later, or more than that, all 25 years later, sorry, my memory of that visit is fragmented, more like a series of snapshots from time to time. And right now, I couldn't tell what I did afterwards, probably because I was still in shock, but not because I hadn't received this kind of news before, but because it was Tom. I do know that the next day I ran the Gay Games 2 marathon, which still stands as my personal best in the marathon, and I ran it not only for me, I ran it for Tom. Fast forward almost another year later, at the end of June of 1987, by that time my run around America was almost 3/4 completed, and Tom's life was almost over as well. Our area road team consisted of me, Mom, and Bill Concoy, the director of the American Run for the End of AIDS. When Tara had to leave us after the first 6 months, Bill packed up his typewriter and files and joined us in Missoula, Montana to take over as our temporary road manager. He also continued to administrate the run, doing most of the advanced work from payphones and campgrounds. We often wondered, what would we have done if we'd had cell phones and computers? Ultimately, Bill ended up being on the road with me and my mother for the final 14 months. As I had fought against the elements and injuries to keep on running every day, Tom had faced one onslaught after another in his battle against AIDS. Yet his passion to make a difference had led him to go public about his struggle, culminating in a powerful and moving profile of him on 2020 by ABC sportscaster Dick Schaap, who had many years later completed a biography of Tom called Gay Olympian. The 2020 piece was aired in April of '87, and I can remember watching it with Mom and Bill in our Winnebago, parked in an East Texas campground near the Louisiana border. We didn't realize then the difficulties that lay ahead of us in the South and in Florida, and how much our experience on the road would in some ways parallel Tom's life and death struggle back in San Francisco. The further east and south the run went that May and June, the worse the heat and humidity became. In order to deal with the extreme conditions I was running under, we altered our schedule so that I would begin at 5 a.m. However, once the sun came up, it was literally a race to finish my 22 miles before it got too much higher in the sky, and I began to fry. The rest, I'm afraid, is all a part of recorded history. Okay. The day after Gay Pride, the Supreme Court announced its Olympic decision. We lost. We no longer had the right to call it the Gay Olympic Games. And 10 days later, on July 11th, Tom died of AIDS. When the run came into Washington, the weekend of the March on Washington, and it's been a pretty amazing experience working on this at Gerber Hart, surrounded by all this amazing memorabilia from the march. That was the first time I saw the quilt laid out, and Mom and I went and found the 10 panels that we made in the Winnebago. And at the demonstration at the Supreme Court, I ran a marathon of protest, 26 miles around the Supreme Court, to raise awareness about the Olympic decision, because we were all there mostly because of the Hardwick decision, which I'm happy to point out we no longer suffer under since that's all been overturned with Lawrence in Texas. It's time for me to finish up. There's so much more to say. Mom, I'm sure you will forgive me for not including your stories and many other stories. I just want to leave, okay, I'm going to leave you with this. And it's something I left people all the way around America. And it was a quote that I got from David Summers, who I used to call the first AIDS activist, because he went on the Phil Donahue show as a person with AIDS. And it was through David I got this quote. And it was from Robert Kennedy in Cape Town, South Africa in 1966. And it still holds true for all of us today who are still concerned with ending the AIDS crisis and ending the anti-gay bullying that still seems to be pervasive in our country, the suicides of our youth. Let no one be discouraged by the belief there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice and violence. Few of us will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And in the total of all those acts will be written the history of this generation. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man or a woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Thank you so much for your support of Gerber Hart and for celebrating your anniversary.